Hi, I'm Steve, the tutor on the RHS Level 2 certificate in the Principles of Plant Growth, Propagation and Development. And we're here with our third taster video, this time covering Unit R2103, Maintaining Plant Health. So it's a little flavour of what the rest of the course is like, with a snapshot of some of the videos from that course, just so you can see the quality of the teaching that takes place, and hopefully to give you the confidence to go out and to purchase this unit as well. So if you're happy with what you see and you hear, please click on the Buy Now option and download the materials. Let's begin our session by understanding the importance of natural balance. Our gardens are incredibly fragile ecosystems in some ways. They are a complex web of producers, and that's the main thing I'm sure most of us are growing in our gardens. That can be plants in any shape or form. There are consumers. That's the animal life that's going on in our gardens, the insects, and to a degree ourselves as well, in consuming what the plants are producing. And then there are the decomposers. So think of all the leaves and the debris that drops down to the floor. Cast your mind back to how organic matter is processed and the organisms that are taking place that are carrying out that. So if we put all of these elements together into the average garden, the ecosystems that are undisturbed and are left to naturally evolve and do what they do on a daily basis reach a balance between the predators and the prey. So cast your minds back to perhaps when you were at school and you learnt about the predator and the prey life cycle. Remember, it was that idea of the numbers of each group were slightly behind each other, but they grew and decreased depending upon the availability of food. There is also an element of nutrient use that goes on as well. So the plant is able to take a lot of the nutrients that it needs from the soil that it's in, and also from the organic matter and the debris that's breaking down around it. And then it's recycling all the time. So those leaves come down in autumn, they break down onto the surface, the nutrients go into the soil, and the plant reuses it. Unfortunately, once we interject humans into the ecosystem, that's when things usually start to go wrong. So we harvest crops, we remove plant material, we spray chemicals, and all of this unfortunately will have some sort of impact or damage to the balance of the ecosystems in our gardens. This is why it's really important that we understand how the ecosystem works and how we can actually end up supporting and encouraging plant growth and what goes on, rather than damaging and destroying it. Plant selection is another important aspect of how we can avoid problems in the garden. So remember, we talked about the right plant and the right place. It's the idea of choosing plants that are appropriate to the site that we have. We may all love a particular style in garden that we would desperately want to have in our own gardens, but if the garden or the site isn't suitable for those types of plants or that type of scheme, it's very little we can do to change that. So if you've got a woodland garden, you're going to really struggle to establish a Mediterranean garden. So it's about understanding our own sites and researching and finding out what we can put in there that's going to do well. Remember, happy plants are going to be healthy plants, and if they're healthy plants, then we're ticking a huge amount of boxes in terms of the garden looking fantastic. We're having less problem with diseases and pests and disorders, and we're also encouraging loads of beneficial organisms, and we're really having a happy and healthy ecosystem in our garden. So what do we need to take into account? First and foremost, we consider the aspect. When we talk about the aspect, what we're talking about is the climate. Is it a cold garden? Is it a warm garden? Is it a north-facing garden, south-facing garden? Does it get impacted by westerly winds? All those sorts of things. We talk about those as being microclimates. And that's important that we understand how those work. We don't go into it in a huge amount of detail in this particular qualification, but the other level 2 RHS qualification covers the importance of microclimates. So we need to understand how that works, and we'll deal with a little bit of that in a future session. The other thing to think about as well is the light levels in our garden. Have we got heavy shade? Have we got buildings that are around us that are casting shadow? How much light do plants get that are in the garden? Because there are different plants for different situations, but understanding aspects and light levels in particular is going to help us appreciate which plants we can use in the space that we've got. But when we look down to, particularly from a healthy point of view, what are the problems that weeds pose? We've already briefly discussed this in our previous session because we've spoken about the problem of weeds being hosts for pests and diseases. So the problem is that many of the weeds that grow in our gardens can provide pests such as aphid with a place to overwinter. And so what that means is if the aphid has managed to overwinter, then come spring there is a rapid infestation of aphids amongst our cultivated plants because they've been hiding amongst the weeds. The other problem is that many weeds can host different viruses and fungal infections and diseases, and then obviously these can be transmitted to our cultivated plants in our gardens. And we'll come into this in a little bit more detail later on. So also remember, removing weeds though, the important thing to remember is that we're trying to break the life cycle of the pest. So we've spoken a little bit about the importance of life cycles, and if we understand life cycles, which we'll come into when we look at our pests and our diseases, we can understand that if we time it right and we break that cycle, we've got a better chance of reducing the disease and therefore the chances of plant problems arising with the plants that we want to keep around our garden. So removing weeds at the right time helps us to break that life cycle. So let's start then with that first one, that cultural method. So we're thinking of ways that we are suppressing the pests, and we're doing that with how we manage our plants and the environment that is around the plant, remember. So a lot of it is very preventative from that point of view. So we're looking at, remember, there may be a series of weeds or plants that are in the garden that are particularly favourable to a type of pest. So we remove that so that the plant can't host those pests anymore. There is that important principle, remember, of crop rotation. If we're constantly moving the different types of plants around in our vegetable areas, we're preventing the build-up of pests in that like a particular type of plant. We keep emphasising this really important thing of good hygiene in our greenhouses, with the tools, making sure we're cleaning them all properly. Even just down to washing our hands and our clothes on a regular basis can help with dealing with these sorts of issues. So that hygiene aspect is really important to start to develop in everything that we do, really. So we're also thinking about what we're doing with the damaged material that might still have pests on them in the form of eggs, larvae, or even sometimes adults. So when we're kind of cutting out maybe the damaged areas, we have to inspect it very carefully to make sure we're not going to drop it onto the compost heap, and the pest then is obviously then within the compost heap and the compost that we're going to use further around the garden. So think about what we're going to do in terms of disposing of the infected plant material. And remember, keep considering those different resistant cultivars that are out there. You know, a quick example there, remember, was that carrot. We have a problem with carrots can be very prone to having carrot fly. So there is a particular variety here called Flyaway, which is supposed to be a little bit more resistant to the carrot fly to stop them damaging our carrots. And think about the principles as well behind the companion planting of what we're doing. So we're planting those plants that might deter pests because they don't like the taste or the smell, or it's a plant that we can use that we don't mind almost sacrificing because the pest will be attracted to that one and leave the plants that we're trying to keep alone. So let's begin by looking at some specific examples of plant diseases. By far the most common one is the fungal infection. When we look at most of the plant diseases that we come across in our gardens, I would suggest that 85% of them are probably fungal infections in some form or another. So they're caused by microfungi, and whilst they might be described as microfungi, they usually are visible to the naked eye. So when you look at something like mildew, you can see specific particles on the leaves there. So we can see them with the naked eye. Very few of them are actually systemic. But as most of them will sit on the surface of the leaf or the surface of the stem, but they are found throughout the plant in one form or another, infecting the plants in a number of different ways. And like most fungal infections, they're going to be spread by spores. So they produce these spores which are moved around through air currents. So that could be the winds lifting those spores off and taking them onto other plants. We also refer to something called rain splash. So when rain comes down and hits the leaves where the fungal spores are, obviously as it hits that, they will cause the spores to rise up into the air or carry them on the splashes in the rain. and some of them are also picked up by insects. So as insects might be feeding on that area of the plant, they'll collect spores on themselves and then fly to another plant where they can reinfect or it can infect another plant and pass the problem on. So generally that's how fungal infections move about. A few examples there at the bottom are mildews. Mildews are by far the most common types of fungal infection. So you've got things like downy mildew, and which particularly impacted our busy lizzies a few years ago. And then we've got probably the most common one, which is our powdery mildews, that kind of white dust that appears on the leaves. And it also includes leaf spots and also some different types of rust as well that we see. All of those will be classed as a fungal infection. And we'll look at some specific examples of fungal infections a little bit in the start of this session a little bit later on. So we're looking for the signs of damage that tell us that a frost has taken place and damaged our plants. The problem with frosts and why they are so damaging is what they do to the plant cells. So remember, when you cast your mind back to when we did our first unit and we were looking at the way that cells work in plants, remember the vast majority of a plant is made up of water. What happens to water when it freezes? The water expands. So you can imagine what's going to happen in a confined space within a leaf or a shoot on a plant, or sometimes even a root if it's a really bad frost. Then what happens is the water expands in each of those cells, it ruptures the cell, or it even kills the cell outright. So we can see it has a massive impact, particularly on leaves and the tips and growing tips of the plant. The worst frosts are generally the ones that we have in the autumn and in the late spring. And the simple reason we've got a problem with those is, if you can imagine, autumn and late spring, as we go into autumn, many of our plants are not quite fully dormant. They're at a point where they're just getting ready for the winter, and they might be in the process of just starting to shed their leaves or just starting to wind down and reduce the water flow through the plant. And then what happens is this frost catches them out. It catches them out because they're still growing, and so it does a lot of damage. And the same with them if we come into late spring. We've got all those new leaves that are out, all those new shoots, and often sometimes we've got buds and flowers that are starting to form. So often those late spring frosts will impact things like our magnolias and camellias, and it'll damage the buds as they start to form. What are we looking for? We're looking for signs of scorching and pale brown patches. That they will appear in between the leaf veins. It will also appear that it is water soaked. So when you look at you can see this quite often on hostas. If they catch a frost, the leaves look water soaked, and they start out by going a dark green before they eventually turn black because all the cells have died in that section. Sometimes as well, on really bad frosts, we can see a splitting in the stems as well on the plants, and occasionally when we get a really deep sort of ground frost that penetrates well down into the surface of the soil, what we get is something called root heave. So what happens with root heave is that the soil, if you like, sometimes pushes the plant out of the ground because of the way the soil is expanding, with the water expanding in the soil at the same time and pushing the plant out. We often see that in some of those newly planted plants that we might have put in maybe in the autumn or first thing in the spring.